The alarm on my console screamed before I even understood why. I was Sci-Fi, a junior aide to the Galactic Council, and I had been staring at the same star chart for 6 hours straight, waiting for a signal that never came. That night, the waiting ended, but not with the answer anyone expected. "Sella, look at this," said Peter Hale, the young technician seated beside me. His voice cracked with something between fear and disbelief. Sol System just dropped every single channel, all of them, at once. I leaned toward the display. Human space, marked in a soft blue glow on our charts, had always been noisy. Trade pings, entertainment broadcasts, colony chatter, endless requests for permits and inspections. Humans talked more than any species I had ever monitored. It was, if I am honest, one of the reasons my superiors found them tiresome. Now there was nothing. Not static, not an error code, just silence, spreading outward from Earth, like ink dropped into water. "Could be a technical failure," I said, though I did not believe it. Peter shook his head. "Not this clean, not this complete. Someone did this on purpose." We did not know yet that 3 days earlier, a hostile fleet belonging to a faction the Council had barely acknowledged, called the Drevoth, had struck at the edge of human territory. We did not know that human ships had been lost, that human colonies had gone dark one by one, that grief was spreading through Sol System faster than any signal ever could. All we knew, in that first moment, was that a species which never stopped talking had suddenly stopped. Within an hour, the council chamber was full. I stood near the back, close enough to hear the arguments, too junior to be asked my opinion, though I formed one anyway. A tall delegate from the Vashkarn hierarchy, robes the color of dried blood, spoke first. "This confirms what many of us suspected. The humans expanded too quickly, defended too little, and paid the price. It is unfortunate, but not surprising." A quieter voice answered him. It belonged to Ambassador Toru Ishikawa, one of the very few humans who still held a seat on the council. For he had aged since I last saw him. His hands trembled slightly on the podium. "You are assuming they are gone," he said. "I am telling you, they are not." "Then explain the silence," the Vashkarn delegate replied. Ambassador Ishikawa did not answer right away. He looked, for a long moment, like a man carrying a secret too heavy to set down. "I cannot," he finally said. "Not because I do not know, because I was asked not to." The chamber erupted into overlapping voices, each species arguing in its own language before the translation systems caught up. I remember feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Whatever Ambassador Ishikawa knew, it frightened him, and very little frightened a man who had spent decades negotiating trade disputes between species that did not always like each other. The council voted, as it always did, slowly and cautiously. A resolution was passed to send an official delegation to Sol System, framed carefully as a mission of remembrance. Privately, everyone understood it as something closer to a funeral. I was chosen to join because my supervisor believed the mission would be uneventful, a formality, good experience for someone early in their career. I did not argue. I wanted to see Earth for myself, even if all that remained of it was wreckage and silence. The journey took 11 days. Our ship, the council vessel Aurelian Accord, carried representatives from 4 different species, along with a small security detachment that everyone insisted was purely precautionary. I spent most of the journey reviewing old human broadcasts, trying to understand a species that had always struck me as loud, impulsive, and strangely determined. There was a particular recording I kept returning to. It showed a human woman named Grace Mallory, a science broadcaster, standing in front of a crowd and saying something that stayed with me long after I first heard it. "We are not the strongest species in the galaxy," she had said, smiling in a way that suggested she found this fact amusing rather than shameful. "We are just the ones who refuse to stop trying." At the time, I had thought it was simple bravado. Now, with Earth silent behind a wall of nothing, the words felt different, heavier. 3 days before we reached Sol System, I met Claire Winters, a communications officer aboard our ship who had spent years studying human transmissions for pattern anomalies. She found me in the observation deck, staring out at the stretch of stars between us and our destination. "You keep watching that recording," she said, nodding toward the small screen still open on my console. "I am trying to understand them," I admitted. "Everyone assumes they are dead, but something about this silence does not feel like death. It feels deliberate." Claire studied me for a moment before answering. "I used to monitor Martian shipping registries for trade compliance. Even after Earth went dark, those registries never stopped filing. Every ship movement, every cargo manifest, still logged, still processed. You do not do that if there is no one left to run the systems." I felt something settle uneasily in my chest. Then why hide it? Why let the galaxy believe they were gone? Claire looked back out at the stars. "That," she said quietly, "is what worries me." We arrived at the outer edge of Sol System on a morning that felt, according to the ship's internal clock, entirely ordinary. There was no ceremony to mark the moment, no warning, just the quiet hum of engines slowing as we crossed into what had once been one of the busiest systems in known space. I stood on the observation deck with Peter and Claire, watching the sensor display update in real time. Historical records showed Sol System thick with traffic, cargo convoys, passenger liners, research vessels moving between Mars and the outer colonies. All of it, once, a constant flow of movement and light. Now there was nothing. Not wreckage, not debris fields, not the drifting remains of a civilization that had lost a fight it could not win. Just empty space, clean and undisturbed, as though someone had reached out and carefully wiped the entire system clear. "This does not make sense," Peter murmured, adjusting the sensors again, certain he had made an error. "If there was an attack severe enough to silence an entire system, there should be something left behind. Fragments, distress buoys, anything." "There is nothing," Claire said, "because nothing happened here, not the way we think." I stared out at the stillness of it, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. It was an old instinct, one that had served every living species well at some point in its evolution. The sense that silence sometimes means danger has passed, and sometimes means danger is simply waiting. Ambassador Ishikawa, who had insisted on joining the delegation despite his age, stood near the viewport with his hands folded behind his back. He had said very little during the journey, but now he spoke, almost to himself. "They always said they would rebuild quietly," he murmured. "I did not think they meant like this." I turned to him. "Rebuild what, Ambassador? There is nothing here to rebuild. There is nothing here at all." He gave me a small, tired smile, the kind that carries more sadness than comfort. "That," he said, "is exactly the point." Before I could ask him to explain, our sensors flared with a sudden alert. A single transmission, tightly encrypted, had reached our ship from somewhere deep inside the empty system. It contained no words, no explanation, just a short string of coordinates, repeating 3 times before falling silent again. Claire's hands moved quickly across her console, cross-referencing the coordinates against old star charts. Her expression shifted from confusion to something closer to disbelief. "These coordinates," she said slowly, "lead to the old shipyards near Ceres. They were listed as decommissioned years ago. Nothing has operated there since before the attack." Peter looked at her, then at me, then back at the screen. "Then why would anyone send us coordinates to an empty shipyard?" I did not have an answer, but as I looked out at the vast, undisturbed stillness of a system that should have been full of ruins, I understood, for the first time, that we had not arrived at the end of humanity's story. We had arrived at its beginning. Ambassador Ishikawa placed a hand gently on the viewport glass, looking out at the stars with an expression I could not fully read. Grief, perhaps, or something closer to quiet pride. "You wanted to know what happened to them," he said softly. "I suggest you prepare yourselves, because I do not think silence ever meant surrender." I think it meant something far more dangerous. The ship's engines shifted course, adjusting to follow the coordinates toward Ceres. No one spoke as we moved deeper into the emptiness of Sol system, the silence around us no longer feeling like an ending, but like the held breath before something enormous was about to happen. I did not know it then, but the story the galaxy believed about humanity, the story of a species that had gone quiet because it had been broken, was about to be proven completely wrong. The shipyards near Ceres were supposed to be empty. That was what every record said, what every satellite scan had confirmed for years, what the Council's own surveys had listed in official archives as decommissioned and abandoned. I remembered reading those files myself, back when Sol system was still just a distant curiosity to me, rather than a mystery unraveling in real time. As our ship approached the coordinates, Claire Winters kept her eyes fixed on the sensor readout, her fingers hovering over the console as though she expected the data to change if she looked away. "This cannot be right," she said. "I am reading structural signatures 3 times larger than anything on record for this location." Peter Hale leaned over her shoulder, studying the same readout. "Maybe the sensors are damaged. We have been flying through a system that should not exist the way it does." "The sensors are fine," Claire said. "I recalibrated them twice." I said nothing, watching the display update as we drew closer. Where the old maps showed a modest facility, barely large enough to service a handful of transport vessels, our scanners now detected structures stretching for kilometers, framed by dry docks unlike anything in the Council's technical archives. Ambassador Ishikawa stood quietly near the viewport, watching the same data with an expression that had shifted from grief to something closer to memory. He looked like a man seeing an old friend after a long absence, uncertain whether to feel relief or worry. "You knew about this," I said to him, unable to keep the accusation out of my voice. "Before we left, you knew Earth was not destroyed." He turned to me slowly. "I suspected," he said. "I was not permitted to confirm." "Permitted by whom?" "By people who understood something the rest of the galaxy did not," he said. "That grief, left alone, either breaks a person or it builds something they never thought themselves capable of building." Before I could press him further, our ship's communication system activated on its own, cutting through the tension in the room. A voice came through, calm and measured, speaking in careful, accented Council standard. "This is Ceres Control. Please hold your current position and confirm identification." Claire exchanged a glance with Peter before responding. "This is the Council vessel Aurelian Accord, representing a delegation from the Galactic Council. We received coordinates directing us to this location." There was a brief pause before the voice returned. "Acknowledged. Permission granted to enter the outer perimeter. Please maintain your current heading and refrain from active scanning of restricted zones." "Restricted zones," Peter repeated under his breath. "In an abandoned shipyard." I stepped closer to the viewport as our ship eased forward, the massive structures of Ceres coming into clearer view. What I saw stole the breath from my chest. The shipyard was not abandoned. It was alive with quiet, deliberate activity. Vessels moved along construction frames far larger than anything I had studied in Council records, their hulls built from alloys our scanners struggled to fully identify. Lights blinked steadily along kilometers of scaffolding, and small transport craft moved between structures with practiced efficiency, the kind that comes only from years of repetition, not weeks. "This is not the aftermath of an attack," Claire said quietly. "This is an industrial center, a massive one." "Then where are the survivors we were sent to mourn?" I asked. Ambassador Ishikawa allowed himself a faint, weary smile. "I imagine," he said, "you are looking at them." Our ship was guided to a docking platform near the edge of the facility, and within minutes, a small welcoming party approached across the hangar floor. I do not know what I expected, perhaps exhausted survivors, thin and desperate, clinging to whatever remained of their civilization. What I saw instead were men and women in simple, practical uniforms, moving with calm confidence, their expressions steady rather than haunted. A woman stepped forward from the group, introducing herself simply as Sophie Lang, a logistics coordinator for the facility. She greeted us with polite formality, as though we had arrived for a scheduled inspection rather than a mission of mourning. "Welcome to Series Yard 7, she said. "I understand this may come as a surprise." "A surprise," I repeated, unable to hide my disbelief, "is an understatement. The council believed your entire species had been destroyed." Sophie's expression softened slightly, though there was no apology in it. "We understand why you believed that," she said. "It was necessary that you did." "Necessary?" Claire said sharply. "You let an entire galaxy believe you were gone." "We let an entire galaxy believe what made sense at the time," Sophie replied evenly. "We did not correct a mistaken assumption, because correcting it would have put everything we were building at risk." I studied her closely, searching for signs of deception, of fear, of the kind of desperation I associated with a species clinging to survival. I found none of it. What I found instead unsettled me more than any wreckage could have. She was calm, confident, utterly certain of what she and her people had accomplished. We were led deeper into the facility, past enormous construction bays where partially completed warships loomed overhead like sleeping giants. I recognized almost nothing about their design. The hulls were thicker than standard council specifications allowed, their weapons systems concealed rather than displayed, their overall shape built for endurance rather than elegance. Peter walked close beside me, his voice low. "I have studied human shipbuilding for years," he said. "I do not recognize any of this." "Because it did not exist before," Ambassador Ishikawa said quietly, overhearing him. "This is new, all of it." We were eventually brought to a wide observation platform overlooking the central construction yard, where a man stood waiting for us, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp with quiet authority. He introduced himself as Daniel Foss, a fleet coordinator, though something in the way the workers around him deferred to his presence suggested his role carried far more weight than the title implied. "You must have questions," he said, before any of us could speak. "An entire galaxy assumed your species was gone," I said. "I believe several questions are owed." Daniel nodded, unbothered by the directness of my tone. 3 years ago, an unprovoked assault struck the edge of our territory," he said. "We lost people. We lost ships. We lost colonies that had taken generations to build. It was, without exaggeration, one of the most painful periods in our history." "Then why hide that pain from the galaxy?" Claire asked, instead of asking for support. "Because support," Daniel said, "often comes with conditions, oversight, restrictions, a promise that the ones offering help will decide how much protection we are allowed to build for ourselves." He paused, glancing briefly at Ambassador Ishikawa before continuing. "We had already lived under those conditions for years. After the attack, we made a decision. If the galaxy believed us gone, no one would interfere with what we chose to build in the silence that followed." "And what exactly," I asked carefully, "did you choose to build?" Daniel's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did, a quiet certainty that reminded me uncomfortably of grief transformed into purpose. "A guarantee," he said, "that what happened to us would never happen again, not to us. Not while we had the ability to prevent it." I looked out over the construction yard, at the countless vessels taking shape in careful, coordinated silence, and felt the full weight of what we had stumbled into. This was not a wounded species clinging to survival. This was a species that had turned its grief into industry, its silence into strategy, and its isolation into something the Council had never accounted for. Ambassador Ishikawa stepped closer to the viewport, his voice quiet but steady. "You asked me earlier," he said to me, "what they were rebuilding. I did not have the full answer then. I believe I do now." "And what is that?" I asked. He looked out at the endless rows of half-formed warships stretching toward the horizon of the construction yard. Themselves, he said, into something the galaxy has never had to consider before. Sophie Lang's voice broke the silence gently. "There is more to see," she said, "and I believe it will answer far more of your questions than words ever could." As we followed her deeper into the facility, I found myself glancing back at Daniel Foss, still standing at the edge of the platform, watching the construction yard with the quiet patience of a man who had waited a long time for this exact moment to arrive. Whatever humanity had been building in their silence, I understood now that it was far from finished, and whatever it eventually became, I suspected the rest of the galaxy would have very little say in the matter. Sophie Lang walked ahead of us with the calm pace of someone who had given this same tour more times than she cared to count, though I doubted anyone from the council had ever seen what waited beyond the next set of doors. We passed through a long corridor lined with observation windows, each one overlooking a different section of the shipyard. Workers moved below us, their motions precise, unhurried, entirely without the chaos I associated with wartime industry. Everything about the place felt deliberate, as though every action had been planned years in advance and simply allowed to unfold. "How long," I asked Sophie, "has this facility been operating at this scale?" "Since shortly after the attack," she said. "Though calling it a single facility understates things. Ceres is one of 11 sites across the system operating at similar capacity." Claire Winters stopped walking. 11, she repeated. "You are telling me there are 10 more places like this?" 11 including this one, Sophie corrected gently. "And that number does not include the smaller support yards scattered through the outer colonies." Peter Hale exhaled slowly beside me, running a hand through his hair. 3 years, he muttered. "You built all of this in 3 years." "We had reason to move quickly," Sophie said, her tone even, though something behind her eyes flickered with old grief, carefully contained. Grief is an excellent motivator when it is given somewhere useful to go. We reached the end of the corridor, where a wide door slid open onto an elevated platform overlooking the largest construction bay I had seen yet. Ambassador Ishikawa stopped beside me, his breath catching audibly as the full scale of it came into view. Below us stretched a vessel unlike anything catalogued in council archives, its hull curving upward in layered plating, weapons ports arranged along its length in patterns clearly built for coordinated defense rather than simple offense. Smaller craft moved around it like insects circling something enormous and patient. "This is a command vessel," Daniel Foss said, joining us on the platform. "One of 12, currently active. Each one coordinates a portion of what we have built." "A portion?" I said carefully. "How many ships are we discussing in total?" Daniel studied me for a long moment before answering, as though weighing how much truth I was prepared to hear. "As of this morning," he said, "slightly over 100,000. The number landed in the room like a physical weight. Claire actually took a step back, her hand pressing against the railing as though she needed something solid to hold on to. Peter said nothing at all, simply staring down at the construction bay with an expression I imagine mirrored my own. "That is not possible," I finally managed. "No species builds a fleet of that size in 3 years, not without sacrificing quality, not without draining every resource available to them." "We drained every resource available to us," Daniel said simply. "That part is true. What you are assuming incorrectly is that we sacrificed quality to do it." Ambassador Ishikawa spoke quietly, his voice thin with something between awe and sorrow. "You gave up everything else, didn't you?" he said. "Trade, growth, comfort, all of it, redirected." Daniel nodded once. "For 3 years, our species built almost nothing that was not connected to this effort," he said. "Every colony contributed, every shipyard operated without pause, every citizen who could work, did. We told ourselves it was temporary, a single, focused push toward one outcome." "And what outcome is that?" I asked. though some part of me already feared the answer. "Security," Daniel said, "not conquest, not revenge, though I will not pretend the thought never crossed anyone's mind after what we lost. Simply the certainty that no faction in this galaxy will ever again mistake our silence for weakness." Sophie led us further along the platform toward a smaller viewing room where a woman sat at a long console surrounded by shifting star charts. She introduced herself as Olivia Marsh, a fleet coordinator responsible for tracking deployment schedules across all 11 shipyards. She barely looked up as we entered, her attention fixed on the data scrolling across her screens. "You will want to see this," she said, without preamble, gesturing toward the largest display. The chart showed Sol system and its surrounding territory, dotted with small markers representing active vessels. As I watched, more markers appeared steadily along the edges of the display, emerging from regions the Council had long assumed empty. "These are silent running formations," Olivia explained. "Ships built and stationed without active transponders, distributed across dozens of systems bordering our territory. Until today, none of them had reason to reveal their positions." "Until today," I repeated. "What changes today?" Olivia glanced toward Daniel, who gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She turned back to her console and typed a short command. The display shifted, and I watched as markers across the entire chart began blinking in unison, transponders activating one by one until the screen was filled with an overwhelming, coordinated bloom of light. "They are no longer hiding," Olivia said quietly. "As of this moment, they are choosing to be seen." I stared at the display, unable to fully process the scale of what I was witnessing. Every marker represented a ship. Every ship represented years of secret construction, careful planning, and a grief so vast it had reshaped an entire civilization's priorities. "Why now?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why reveal this, while we happen to be standing here?" Daniel's expression shifted for the first time since we had met him, something resembling quiet resolve settling into his features. "Because the Council needed to see it firsthand," he said. "Reports could be dismissed, rumors could be doubted. This," he gestured toward the display, "cannot be denied." Ambassador Ishikawa placed a trembling hand against the console, his eyes fixed on the countless glowing markers. "How long," he asked softly, "have you been waiting to show someone this?" "Long enough," Daniel said, "that waiting no longer serves any purpose." I turned back toward the viewport, overlooking the construction bay, watching the massive command vessel below us continue its final preparations. Workers moving around it with the same calm determination I had seen throughout the facility. Somewhere beyond Sol system, across dozens of systems the Council had long considered peripheral and unimportant, an entire fleet was waking from years of careful silence. "There is something else you should understand," Daniel said, drawing my attention back to him. "This was never simply about defense." "Then what was it about?" I asked. He looked out at the shipyard, his voice quiet but resolute. "It was about making certain that the next time someone decided humanity was an acceptable target, they would understand exactly what that decision would cost them." Sophie Lang stepped closer, her earlier calm now edged with something firmer. "We did not build this fleet to threaten the Council," she said. "We built it because the ones who attacked us 3 years ago are still out there, still watching, still convinced we were too weak, too scattered, too dependent on outside protection to ever recover." "The Drevoth," Ambassador Ishikawa said quietly, the name settling into the room with quiet weight. "They believed you would never rebuild. They believed wrong," Daniel said simply. I looked back at the display, at the overwhelming bloom of activated transponders spreading across star systems I had once considered safely distant from any conflict. The scale of it defied comprehension. 100,000 ships, built in silence, waiting patiently for a moment exactly like this one. "What happens now?" I asked, though I suspected none of us, human or otherwise, fully knew the answer. Daniel turned to look at me directly, his expression calm, despite the enormity of what surrounded us. "Now," he said, "the ones who believed silence meant surrender are about to learn how wrong they were." Behind him, through the wide viewport, I watched as the massive command vessel's engines flared to life for the first time, casting long shadows across the construction bay as it prepared, at last, to leave the shipyard that had built it. Whatever silence Earth had carried for 3 years, I understood now that it was ending. Not quietly, not gradually, all at once. The alert reached the council chamber before our delegation ship had even left Ceres, and by the time we returned to open space, the entire structure of galactic communication had shifted into something close to controlled panic. I stood on the bridge of the Aurelian Accord beside Claire Winters, watching reports stream in from a dozen different tracking arrays across council territory. Every few seconds, another system reported the same impossible pattern. Ships, previously undetected, decloaking in perfect formation along borders that had been considered quiet and unremarkable for years. "This is not isolated to Sol System," Claire said, her voice tight with disbelief. "They are appearing everywhere. Colonies bordering Vashkarn territory, trade routes near the outer rim, even systems close to Drevoth space." Peter Hale leaned over her shoulder, watching numbers scroll faster than either of us could process. "How many locations are we talking about?" he asked. "At last count," Claire said, 43 separate systems." Ambassador Ishikawa stood near the viewport, his hands folded tightly behind his back, watching the chaos unfold with an expression that mixed pride with quiet apprehension. "They planned this precisely," he said. "Every location, every timing. Nothing about this is accidental." I opened a direct channel to the council chamber, requesting an emergency session, though I suspected by the volume of overlapping requests already flooding the system, I was far from the only one making that call. When the chamber convened, the atmosphere was unlike anything I had witnessed in my time serving the council. Delegates who normally maintained careful diplomatic composure now spoke over one another, their voices raised, their usual patience abandoned entirely. The Vashkarn delegate, who had once dismissed humanity's silence as evidence of their destruction, now stood rigid at his podium, his expression unreadable beneath layers of formal robing. "Explain this," he demanded, directing his words toward Ambassador Ishikawa. "Explain how a species we believed extinguished has produced a fleet capable of appearing across half the known galaxy in a single coordinated moment." Ambassador Ishikawa stepped forward, his voice steady, despite his obvious exhaustion. "I did not know the full scale until today," he admitted. "But I suspect the answer is simple. My people did not disappear. They prepared." "For what purpose?" another delegate demanded, this one from a smaller trade coalition near the rim. "Conquest? Retaliation? Some grievance against the council for failing to intervene sooner?" I found myself speaking before I had fully decided to. "From what I witnessed at Ceres," I said, drawing surprised glances from several delegates who had not expected a junior aide to address the chamber directly, "this was never about the council at all. It was about the ones who attacked them." The chamber fell into an uneasy quiet as the enormous star chart at the center of the room updated once more, new markers blooming steadily along the border of Drevoth territory. Even from a distance, the pattern was unmistakable. Humanity's fleet was not scattering randomly across the galaxy. It was converging, slowly and deliberately, toward a single destination. "They are moving toward Drevoth space," the Vashkarn delegate said quietly, some of his earlier hostility fading into something closer to concern. "An entire fleet, moving as one, toward the faction responsible for attacking them 3 years ago." Ambassador Ishikawa's expression tightened. "Then I imagine we are about to witness something the Council has never had reason to consider before," he said. "A species delivering its own answer without waiting for permission to do so." A tense silence spread through the chamber as the star chart continued to update, ship markers steadily aligning into formations too precise to be anything other than deliberate strategy. I found myself thinking back to Daniel Foss, standing on that platform at Ceres, his calm certainty when he had spoken of security rather than conquest. I understood now what he had meant. The chamber's communication system chimed suddenly, cutting through the tense murmur of overlapping voices. A transmission request appeared on the main display, its origin listed simply as Earth. The chamber fell utterly silent as the request was accepted, and a single image filled the screen. It showed a woman standing in what appeared to be a modest command room, her uniform simple, her posture calm. She introduced herself as Grace Mallory, though something in her bearing suggested she now held far more authority than her earlier career as a science broadcaster might have implied. "To the Galactic Council," she began, her voice measured and unhurried. "3 years ago, our species suffered an attack that many of you never fully acknowledged, and few of you offered meaningful assistance to address. We understood, in the aftermath, that assistance would come with conditions we were unwilling to accept." The chamber remained silent, delegates from a dozen species watching the transmission with expressions ranging from discomfort to open apprehension. "We chose silence instead," Grace continued. "Not because we were broken, but because silence gave us the freedom to rebuild without interference. What you are witnessing now is the result of that choice." The star chart behind her flickered briefly, displaying the same overwhelming bloom of activated fleet markers we had watched moments earlier. "This is not a declaration of war against the Council," she said. "We have no interest in conflict with any species who did not choose to harm us. But we will no longer accept protection that comes bundled with restriction, nor mercy extended only when convenient for those offering it." Ambassador Ishikawa closed his eyes briefly, as though hearing something he had long anticipated but hoped never to witness, delivered so plainly. "To the Drevoth," Grace continued, her tone shifting only slightly, though the weight behind her words grew unmistakably heavier. "You believed our silence meant surrender. You believed a species without immediate allies could be struck without consequence. We are reaching out today not to negotiate, but to inform you that the consequence you assumed would never arrive has, in fact, been building steadily above your borders for quite some time." The transmission ended as abruptly as it began, leaving the chamber in a silence far more profound than the one that had followed Earth's initial disappearance 3 years earlier. This silence was not born of assumption or uncertainty. It was born of understanding. The Vashkarn delegate finally spoke, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it. "They are not asking our permission," he said. "No," Ambassador Ishikawa replied. "I do not believe they intend to ask anyone's permission again." I looked toward the star chart one final time, watching the fleet markers continue their slow, deliberate advance toward Drevoth territory, 100,000 ships moving with the calm inevitability of something long overdue. Whatever the galaxy had believed about humanity 3 years ago, whatever comfortable assumptions the Council had built around a species it considered manageable and dependent, all of it had just been rendered permanently obsolete. The silence Earth had carried for 3 years was not weakness. It had been patience. And patience, I now understood, had simply run its course. No one in the council chamber moved for several long moments after Grace Mallory's transmission ended, and I remember thinking, quite clearly, that I was witnessing the exact instant an entire galaxy's understanding of a species shifted beyond recovery. The star chart continued updating in front of us, the fleet markers advancing steadily toward Drevoth territory with a discipline that unsettled me more than any display of raw aggression could have. There was no chaos in their movement, no desperation. Just quiet, coordinated intention, the kind that comes only from years of careful planning finally being allowed to unfold. Ambassador Ishikawa remained near the podium, his hands still trembling slightly, though his expression had settled into something resembling calm acceptance. I approached him quietly, aware that every delegate in the chamber was too consumed by their own private calculations to notice our conversation. You always knew this day would come, I said. He nodded slowly. I suspected it, he said. I did not know when, and I did not know the scale. I do not think anyone outside a very small circle did. Why tell you at all? I asked. Why let anyone outside their own people know even a fragment of the truth? He considered the question carefully before answering. Because someone needed to carry the weight of understanding, even if they could not act on it, he said. I imagine they trusted me to hold that weight responsibly, and to help the council adjust once the truth could no longer be hidden. Our conversation was interrupted as the chamber's tracking systems updated once more, this time displaying live sensor data gathered from observation posts near Dravoth territory. The images showed the massive human fleet arriving at the edge of Dravoth space, formations spreading outward with practiced precision, though notably, no offensive action had yet been taken. They are not attacking, Claire Winters said, having joined us near the podium, her eyes fixed on the display. They are simply present. A demonstration, Ambassador Ishikawa said quietly, not an assault. The Dravoth response, when it finally came, arrived not as a counterattack, but as a hurried, almost desperate diplomatic transmission, requesting immediate contact with human command. The chamber watched, transfixed, as the Council's own monitoring systems intercepted portions of the exchange, translated in real time for those present. The Dravoth envoy's voice carried none of the confidence I imagined they must have held 3 years earlier, when they believed striking at a scattered, disorganized species would carry no lasting consequence. We request clarification of your intentions, the envoy said, his voice tight with poorly concealed unease. Your fleet's presence at our border was not anticipated. Daniel Foss's voice answered calmly, broadcast clearly enough that the entire council chamber could hear his response. Our intentions are simple, he said. We are here to ensure you fully understand the consequences of ever considering an attack against our people again. Nothing more, nothing less. You have not opened fire, the envoy said carefully, as though testing the boundaries of an agreement no one had yet stated aloud. We have no interest in becoming the aggressors you once assumed we could never become, Daniel replied. We are simply making certain you understand exactly what you would be facing should that assumption ever return. The transmission ended shortly after, leaving both the Dravoth envoy and the council chamber in stunned silence. I looked toward Ambassador Ishikawa, searching for some sign of triumph or vindication in his expression. Instead, I found only quiet exhaustion, the kind carried by someone who had waited far too long for a moment they were not entirely certain they wanted to witness. They chose restraint, I said, somewhat surprised by my own relief at the realization. They chose to demonstrate strength without needing to prove it through destruction, Ambassador Ishikawa said. I imagine that distinction matters greatly to them. Over the following hours, as the council chamber continued its fractured, uncertain debate over how to respond to a species it no longer fully understood, I found myself standing near the observation window, watching the star chart's steady display of humanity's fleet, motionless now at the edge of Dravoth space, patient and unthreatening, yet utterly unmistakable in its capability. Sophie Lang's voice reached me through a private channel, requesting a brief exchange before our delegation formally departed council space to return to our respective assignments. I accepted, curious what final words she might offer. I wanted to thank you, she said, for approaching all of this with more openness than most of your colleagues managed. I am not certain openness is the right word, I admitted. I am still trying to understand what I witnessed. That is fair, she said, offering a small, tired smile. I imagine it will take the rest of the galaxy quite some time to understand it as well. What happens now, I asked, between your people and the Council, between your people and the Dravoth? That remains to be decided, she said, but I can tell you this. We are not seeking further conflict. We built what we built to ensure we never again had to fear becoming a target simply because we appeared weak or dependent. Beyond that, our intentions remain what they always were, to grow, to explore, to be treated as equals, rather than as a species requiring careful management. I considered her words carefully. The Council will need time to adjust to that. We understand, she said. We are prepared to give them that time. We are simply no longer prepared to wait for permission to defend ourselves while doing so. Our conversation ended shortly after, and within the day, our delegation departed Council space, returning toward our respective postings with a very different understanding of humanity than the one we had carried on our journey to Sol System. In the following weeks, reports continued arriving steadily. The human fleet withdrew from Drevoth space without incident, returning instead to defensive positions along their own borders, their presence now an openly acknowledged fact rather than a carefully guarded secret. Trade discussions slowly resumed, though conducted now on notably different terms, with human representatives negotiating not as a dependent species seeking protection, but as equals capable of enforcing whatever agreements they entered into. Ambassador Ishikawa remained on the Council for only a short time longer before formally retiring, though I understood from later reports that he maintained close contact with Earth's new leadership, serving in some informal capacity as an advisor during the difficult transition that followed. I often think back to that first night, watching Sol System's transmissions fall silent across my console, certain at the time that I was witnessing the aftermath of tragedy. I understand now how completely mistaken that assumption was. Humanity had not gone quiet because they were broken. They had gone quiet because grief, given the right amount of time and purpose, does not always lead to collapse. Sometimes it leads to transformation, so complete that the ones who caused it never fully recognize the consequences of their own actions until it is far too late to undo them. I do not know what role humanity will ultimately choose to play within the wider galaxy, whether as cautious allies, careful neutral parties, or something entirely new that none of us yet have proper language to describe. What I do know, with complete certainty, is that the galaxy's earlier assumptions about them, assumptions of fragility, of dependence, of manageable weakness, have been permanently and irreversibly proven wrong. The silence that once surrounded Earth was never an ending. It was simply humanity holding its breath, quietly and patiently, until the exact moment it finally chose to exhale. And when it did, 100,000 points of light turned the darkness of the galaxy gold, announcing, without a single word of aggression, that the era of humanity requiring anyone's protection had ended, permanently and entirely on their own terms.